let's start. Questions that you have about this ending section of the book. And it might be helpful, when you have your book. Because we'll be referencing plenty of it. Any questions at all? Okay, so then let's flip and talk about the quiz. How did you approach the question?
I used the fact that Gatsby, in pursuit of what he thought was the American dream, kind of accomplished nothing in the end.
Okay.
Kind of died without a lot of friends. Barely anyone even showed up to his funeral.
Yes.
Mostly just paparazzi and make all eyes in his dad.
Mm-hmm. And then, so how does that connect with the Lost Generation?
Well, the Lost Generation, I believe, they they lost their way and to compensate for the fact that all of this depressing things were going on. They pursued material goods and their dreams to try and compensate for that.
Okay.
But they kind of lose their ideals.
Yes.
What actually is happiness, I guess. I don't know. To really explain.
You're on right paths, but how does this and the funeral show that?
I mean, Daisy, who he was pursuing most of the book, doesn't even show up. She just packs up and leaves.
Yes.
Before it.
Okay, so you've got lots of pieces there, but you've got to understand your commentary is non-existent. Here again, we're kind of running into that problem we talked about earlier in the week, where you've got all the pieces set out. Absolutely. I can see the connections, but on any kind of a piece of writing, if you're not drawing those connections strongly enough, they're not going to give you the credit for it. So when we're looking at building this as an argument, it's really, hey, how do these things work together? And how does my commentary knit them to address? So if I'm going to step in and kind of build some of these things, I would definitely be able to talk about the fact that by the end of the book, Fitzgerald makes a very clear statement to say that to Gatsby, Daisy is his dream. It's his version of the American dream. And then he broadens it out to start to talk about how the American dream applies to that generation. Now, what we see with the funeral is one of those things that adds up to how we get this message from the end about how the American dream is viewed, for sure. And you brought up some of those ideals. A focus on materialism. There seems to be that lack of people as well, true, genuine connection that's present. Did anybody pick this idea up, and maybe you can explain a little bit better or take it to the next place?
I talked about how Gatsby and his dad came and how I promise this will connect at some point.
It's okay, and that's the thing. We want to have these chances to talk it through, not to criticize, but to instead get you to build those connections on how we build these arguments. Sometimes it takes that chance to vocalize and talk it through and get it, because they're abstract ideas that exist in your head. But in order to make our writing more effective, we've got to see how to draw those connections.
So I talked about how his dad came with the old book that Gatsby had about his self-improvement plan. And I talked about how he really did have lots of ambition, but he put it all towards one thing, which was Daisy. And in order to get that, he needed to get a bunch of wealth. So I put that basically his ambition still led to materialism, just like everybody else, because he wanted somebody who was in that generation too. If that makes sense.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to retrace this. Gatsby's dad shows up. Is it at all what we expected? No, because even more so, Gatsby has been specific to tell us his dad is dead. He doesn't have any family. Even when we hear about his background in chapter 4 or chapter 6, when they bring it up, they mention that his family were poor farmers, but that's it. So for this guy to all of a sudden show up out of nowhere, whoa. Did you catch what he calls him? Does he call him Jay? Jimmy. He even gets really indignant when somebody says Mr. Gatsby to him. He's like, no, Gats. Gats is my name. Now think about this, all right? We've heard about this suave, great figure of Gatsby through the whole book. Would you imagine anybody walking up to this guy and calling him Jimmy? Like, it's a boy's name. It's really strange. Think in your own sense. Do your parents have a name for you? Maybe it's a shorter version of your name. Maybe it's a nickname. Maybe it's your full name that they use that no one else uses. And it's kind of off-putting when you're in a situation with your parents and your friends, and they use that other name, and you're just like, stop it. Don't do it.
It's kind of how I am.
Yeah.
Because I have 2 names technically,
Mm-hmm.
but whenever someone that I'm not used to saying the other name,
Yeah.
it just like freaks me out.
Yeah, it's just odd. Like, so my legal name is Matthew. Everybody that's a friend of mine knows me as Matt. My parents still call me Matthew. My grandparents still call me. So it's that thing of like, when people say it, it's just like, no, fix it. No. To you, I'm not. No. And the same way, I have a friend. I went to high school with him. He lives 2 doors from me now, right? I've always known him as Pat. His full name is Patrick. All the time that he's dated his wife, that she always calls him Patrick, and I always go like, you don't know him. You're not. What do you know? And I always look at him like, dude, really? You're gonna let her call you that? And he's like, think about this. It all of a sudden opens up this whole different end. Having Gatsby's father shows up all of a sudden blows up our perspective. We thought we knew this guy. We thought that we've gotten these details. We feel like we can rely on him just a bit. And then all of a sudden we get a wrench to go, no, we've never been able to rely on Gatsby. He's basically been creating his own concept the entire time. His dad pulls out this book. It's a children's book, Hop Along Cassie. It's a cowboy character. But what's important is this plan that's written on the inside cover of the book. It schedules out his whole day, and it shows that even from a very young age, Gatsby had a concept to improve himself. And even if you notice on that list, 2 things that stand out. One, he leaves time for inventions. Now, as a little kid, you might have thought, like, I can invent things. I can do it. Think about how that translates into adult Gatsby, who basically reinvents his entire self. Okay, it kind of goes back to that fairy wing thing that we talked about in chapter 6. Also on that list, he mentions practice elocution. Do you know what that is?
Like speaking.
Speaking properly. And if you notice in the book, after he reads that list, Mr. Gats says something to the effect of like, he once told me I ate like a hog. And he says it instead of ate, eat, he says et with an accent. Very clearly the opposite of elocution. It's almost as though Gatsby looks around himself as a child and realizes, I've got to be better than all of this. So even from a young age, he's very focused there. He definitely can show us that trend towards Daisy. Now, if we're going, how does that work with the lost generation concept? It can bring in that idea that for this generation, they don't really, they had ideals as young children of what they wanted to do and what they thought the world was, but clearly the experiences of war have changed all of those. They now don't know how to go forward into this world of adulthood, into this world of everything being so very different. Anybody else talk about something different? Go ahead, bring it. You're good.
I talked about how he's talked about it was a story of Westerners because they're all from the West, but they went back to the East.
Yeah. Do you remember how he introduces this concept of this book being a story of the West? Anybody have that? Like what he uses, how he builds that imagery and that thing in? Okay, if you flip open your book, 175. It's an image that sticks in readers' heads because it's so obtuse given everything else. It's so sudden and stark and different, especially for it being so late in the book. It grinds its way into people's heads, but they don't know how to use it. They don't know what to do with it. And it's this image he presents after the break on 175 of a train. He talks about being on a train coming home from college at Christmas. And, starting with all of your friends, and slowly as you move out, people get off at their stop and they go forth, but being surrounded by the snow. Think about the feeling that Christmas brings into you. And maybe it's not the sort of thing of like, it's going to be different from everybody, but think about the idea of like, you're out Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, you're driving to somebody's house and you pass Walmart and there are no cars in the parking lot. It has that clear impression of like, everybody should be home with the people they love. Even if you're not somebody that's Christian and you don't follow that, you don't practice Christmas, there's a certain feeling about that time of year and connectedness and the fact that everything just closes. He uses that as a way to talk about, that is what I am used to from my youth. That is something that to me feels right about America, that for that moment on the train coming home, being surrounded by snow, having that feeling, that's when I felt connected to America, and now I don't. And he uses it as a way to say, hey, the train was going west, and I realized in this moment that all of us, Tom, Daisy, even Jordan, Gatsby, we all are people that were born in the West. Now, some of you might be like, isn't Daisy from Kentucky? Like, how can you be from the West if you're from Kentucky? Remember, it's 1925. Pretty much, the country is split into 3 parts. Yeah, I can kind of zone this. I'm not going to try to draw a map of America, but it's going to work. Maybe, hopefully. Let's see. I'm going to go like this. Pretty much have 2 parts. You have the northeast section. This would be everything like Chicago, east and north. All the big industrial parts of the country. Then you have the west, which really is more like this. And then you have the south. That's about it. Bring in your U.S. history for a second. Before we come back to the book, bring in your U.S. history. What does this part of the country mean to us as Americans?
Manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny. So explain.
Manifest destiny, just keep moving to the west, go from ocean to ocean.
Yeah. And what's a word maybe that comes up when you think about manifest destiny and what the West could represent because of it? I'm not looking for any one particular word. There's lots of words we can use.
I'd say it was not as developed as the East.
It's not. So what does that offer?
Opportunity.
Opportunity. Promise. There's a certain fantasy to the West. Think about what kinds of characters, when we think about Western American culture, come to mind. Stereotype it. Come on. The Wild West, cowboys. Cowboys didn't exist like we think they did. Like, no, that's an image that we conjured. But guess what? We love it because it's the guy who can go out on his own and affect change and stand for values and have these adventures. Think about, did you ever play Oregon Trail as a kid? You're probably too old, too young. Okay, good. At least you've seen it at some point, right? Did you see the really old one? Everybody died.
Everyone got disappeared.
Yeah, either that or, there's lots of things. Think about that concept of Oregon Trail, that this journey, we've been able to like collapse it into this simple, like, oh, you just go. Think about the idea of going, this hits me a lot of times when I go to like New Mexico or Colorado and, I'm driving out there And you think about, like, there didn't used to be fences. Even in 1925, right before that, you could literally get on a horse and just kind of ride. Nothing would stop you. Nothing would be in your way. And you could just go. And then you compare that to what Nick finds in New York. Society, people who are fake, people who don't care. He comes to define that really this is a story of the West because these are people that should have stayed West, not gone East. Had they stayed to the West, they wouldn't have gotten caught up in this, as he says. And he presents this image on 176. Maybe. Yeah, this image towards the bottom of the page, he talks about it as a night scene by El Greco. El Greco is a painter. But this concept of a well-dressed woman who has passed out and is being carried home by these other guys, and they turn in at a house, and it's not her house, and no one really cares. And you're like, oh, wow, that's kind of like a summation of how these people have acted in the whole book, whether they're people that come to Gatsby's parties or whether it's Daisy and Tom as a whole. People just kind of do stuff and act fancy and eh. And so as Nick talks about this, he talks about, I got to go home. This place isn't right for me. Now, remember, this book takes place over one summer. And so at the beginning of the book, he sees he thinks that the East has these new things, but then he's been turned off by the cynicism of it. Is that a word anybody used? Cynicism. I didn't spell that right, I don't think. We talked about that cynical ideal that crept into the Lost generation, how they viewed everything negatively, how they thought that everything was bad. Now we're going to start to take the turn. You ready? American Dream. Kind of like the West here. Again, we're going to try to lean on your history knowledge, so go with me. What do you assume about the American Dream?
It's like building yourself up, standing on your own 2 feet, making your own wealth.
Exactly. This place is a place of opportunity. Anybody can have it. You just got to work hard enough. You can have your house, you can have your 2 cars, you can have your 2.5 kids. It's the old like statistical average, how many kids every family has. It's not like the old Michael Jackson joke. No, you don't know that one? Why did Michael Jackson get so excited when he went to Walmart? He saw a sign that said boys' pants half off. Anyway, it's a bad joke. It's okay. Last page. Let's start to talk about it because this is where we make the turn and start to see where he does this work, but he brings in all these ideas that we've talked about. Nick sits on the beach. He looks out at Gatsby's, at all these houses. And what does he imagine?
There's no house.
There's no houses. What does he think back to?
The explorers.
Which explorers? Dutch. And if you know your history, first people to colonize New York, the Dutch. Remember, it used to be New Amsterdam. So here, he's thinking, what did this place look like to the first guy that came across and saw that opportunity, that place, right?
A lot of ambitions.
What we are seeing is the birth of the American dream. The ambition, the promise, the opportunity. And then Nick thinks to now. Now he has watched this guy create this image of what he sees his American dream as being, this single girl. Was this ever possible? No, because what is it that Gatsby really wanted? Did he want Daisy Buchanan? He wanted Daisy Faye. So what Gatsby wanted was a dream rooted in the past. It's why at the end of the party, and he talks about you can't repeat the past. Yes, you can. He wants something that's impossible. 1920s. Lost generation, goes to war, sees so many people die, comes back, doesn't understand what's going on. To them, does the American dream seem like it's something that's ahead of them or something that's behind them? Like the promise of the West. So he gives us this image on the last page of a boat going against the current. These people want things in the lost generation, but it seems like they're constantly born backwards. It's a dream that exists behind them. And so as he's hitting this last part, he's really showing that for his generation, this dream is something from an older age that they probably won't get. But you notice at the end of the page, he talks about how they will go on regardless. They will be the boat against the current. Even though they don't think that it could happen, cynicism, they still hope for the opportunity that at some point it can. Are you with me? Are things making sense where you're going, okay, I'm seeing some of these connections coming across. There's a lot of stuff here we didn't get to. We didn't talk about George Wilson at all. The way that George Wilson stares at that billboard of Dr. Eckelberg's eyes and talks about how you can't fool God. Hey, who would look over a land of the dead, like we said the Valley of the Ashes is? Billboards of a set of eyes looking over all these ashes, the Valley of the Dead. Who looks over the Valley of the Dead? Don't overthink it. God. So if he's looking at a billboard and he says, you can't fool God, this is a book that is totally missing a religious end except for that. And then right as we go to the next part, Gatsby's pumping up that thing and going into the pool, and he's described in a way that's a lot like Jesus. He gets his cross, the thing he's going to die on. He has to re-shoulder it a little bit. Now, I'm not saying we elevate him in that way, but religion is something that is missing from this lost generation because of their cynical nature. The book touches briefly on this ideal. We didn't talk at all about lots of things. So next week, we're going to try to roll some of these things in, give us some good ideas, and start to put together some notes that will help us in the long term for where we go with this. All right. So remember, next week, there we go.